The murder spree at Alligator Creek near Mackay in Queensland in 1911 is among the worst crimes in Australian history. Charles R. Ching was a haka from a small town named Sha Tau Kok, the northernmost town in Hong Kong. The Hakka are Han Chinese people who emigrated from the north to the south of China during turbulent periods in Chinese history. His real name was Shum, but he adopted his new name when he went to Australia in the 1880s to participate in the gold rush in northern Queensland. Agnes Crang was born in Barnstaple, Devon in 1866. Charles and Agnes married in Townsville on the 20th of January 1886. The first of their 10 children arrived later that year. Florence Lucy was the firstborn. She married Charles Wong Kee in 1905, and they lived in Townsville. The eldest son, Charles Henry, was born in 1887, but sadly died when he was less than 2 years old, in January 1889. Another daughter, Henrietta, followed in December 1889. Henrietta married Ernest Steindl in July 1911, and the couple went to live in Bundaberg. Henry was born in November 1891. As a schoolboy, he won a scholarship to Rockhampton Grammar School, but had to leave school when he was 15 to contribute to the family income. He worked as an errand boy and learned shorthand in his spare time before becoming a journalist. In 1911, he was on the staff of the Mackay Standard newspaper. Ada May was born in 1893, Maud Agnes in 1896, Edward Frederick in 1902, Dorothy Grace in 1904, Richard Hugh in 1906, and finally Winifred Amy was born on the 9th of July 1910. When first married, the couple ran a store at the corner of Victoria and Brisbane Streets in Townsville. They went to Brisbane, but did not remain long in the capital before moving to Rockhampton, where they resided for 14 years. In 1905, the family moved to Mackay, Charles growing sugarcane at Farley. They moved to Alligator Creek, between Mackay and Serena, in 1908. The family was well known and favourably thought of by the Serena and Alligator Creek communities. Their house was a simple structure made of galvanised iron, 20 feet by 10 feet on a wooden frame, with an earthen floor covered by old Hessian bags as a carpet. The front room was divided into two with a curtain, and there were 2 back rooms, one used for dining and the other as a bedroom. The house was situated on a rise 3 miles from Alligator Creek, on the Plain Creek side at a locality called Acacia Vale. The home was reached from Grass Tree Road, which cut through heavily timbered country east of the Willisford Hotel. The Plain Creek Mill tram line ran at the back of the farm, only a few hundred yards from the dwelling. North of the house were stables. The nearest neighbour was about 1/4 of a mile to the north. A small sugarcane crop grew at the back of the house, which had been harvested in early November. Charles employed one man on his small farm, a 28-year-old named George David Silver. Silver had been born in 1884 in the Mackay district of Queensland to Sinhalese parents from Ceylon. They were among a large number of Sinhalese workers who had arrived in Queensland in the early 1880s. George was of a slight build. He had lived for many years on the north coast of New South Wales, but had returned to Mackay in 1909 and worked as a farm labourer ever since. He had worked 12 weeks for Ching before leaving for 6 weeks. He returned to the farm 3 weeks ago. On the 17th of November 1911, Charles had some business to attend to at Plain Creek Mill, 8 miles from Alligator Creek by tram. He left his wife at home with Maud, Hughie and baby Winnie, and the farmhand, George Silver. Teddy and Dolly had already left to attend school. On the way to his appointment, he stopped at Beresford's at Plain Creek Mill, where May Ching was employed. While conversing with his 18-year-old daughter, he asked her when she would be coming to spend a day with the family. May said she would be out one day during the week. Then she asked how they all were at home. Thinking of his beloved family, Charles replied, "Well and happy." After visiting with his daughter, Charles went to see a Mr. Williams on some matter. Then he returned home, reaching his property at about 5 p.m. The kitchen was situated about 120 yards south from the main building, at the foot of the ridge, and it was here that he went when he reached home. Charles was feeling peckish and prepared a meal with the help of Silver. Both men then sat down to enjoy a hearty meal. It was then that Charles realised the main house was closed up, and guessed his family had gone to call on one of the neighbours. As the time passed and they had not returned, Charles decided to try to find out where they were, and ventured out accompanied by Silver, calling on the Kioskis. Then, when they had not seen them, he and Silver went to the Williams, and finally went to Jim Carey's at about 9 p.m. Again they had not been there, so Charles returned home, somewhat mystified. Carey mentioned he'd heard shots from the direction of the Ching farm between 3 and 4 p.m. Mrs. Carey said she thought it strange that Charles hadn't checked his own place first before calling on the neighbours. Gracie Carey, their daughter, remarked when she had come home from school with Eddie and Dolly, they had seen a man walking along the tram line towards the farm, wearing black trousers, a white shirt and white hat. While Charles waited for his family to return, he tried the door, and found it was locked from the inside. Something about the situation began to trouble him. He got Silver to hold a lantern at the sitting room window, and he opened it and climbed through, and discovered a nightmare. In the front room was a pile of bodies, pushed together and covered with a colourful table cover, upon which had been placed a large family Bible. The room showed no other disturbance, and trails of blood showed that the bodies had been dragged from the back room used as the girls' bedroom and dumped where they currently lay. Agnes, 45, and her children Maud, aged 14, Hughie, aged 4, and little Winnie, 16 months old, had all been killed hours before. The back room was spattered with blood all over, on the walls, the floor, and under the bed. A mosquito net over the bed was torn and splashed with spots of blood. Shocked, Charles retreated and called for Silver, bidding him get a horse and ride to Mr. Carey's and inform him of what had occurred, and then to go on to Mr. Innes and relate the horrible news to him as well, and then go and inform Harry Ching. Silver went to Carey's and imparted the information, and then rode on to James Inn's place, where he arrived between 3 and 4 in the morning, and declared, "There's a madman about." Innes asked why he said that, and Silver replied, "The Ching family are all murdered." After going to James Inn's, he kept riding, going all the way to Mackay, to arrive about 10 o'clock at the Victoria Hotel, where he knew Henry Ching was lodging, and informed the young man of the tragedy. Henry immediately got a sulky ready and set off for Alligator Creek, but at Plain Creek friends met him and convinced him not to go on to the dreadful scene. Instead, it fell to Henry to break the news to his sister May. Her employer, Beresford, had merely said that there had been an argument on the farm. Constable Brett, accompanied by George Beresford and Alexander Innes, who were both justices of the peace, set out for the farm the following morning at 7:30 a.m. A telephone wire had rusted, breaking communications for a time, until it was detected and fixed. At first it was thought the killer may have sabotaged the line, before the fault was found. When it was fixed, Dr. Hall was summoned to the Ching residence. Inspector Sweetman and 3 more constables also converged upon the farm. The door to the sitting room was opened, and the men gazed in horror at the sight before them. A cloud of flies, disturbed by the attention, rose from the bodies. Dr. Hoare examined the bodies to determine how each had died. Agnes had been shot in the left side of the neck, near the spinal cord, with a shotgun. A cut over the right eye appeared due to a lack of bleeding to have been inflicted after death. Maud too had been shot, but with a revolver, in the right side of the back of her neck, the bullet severing arteries on its trajectory, emerging from the girl's mouth under her tongue. A pellet wound on her hand had probably been caused when her mother was shot. Maud's body was practically naked when found, her clothes disarranged and torn. Little Huey had been found with his skull smashed in. His baby sister had also been bashed repeatedly, until her head was beaten to a pulp. Once the medical examinations had been completed, the bodies were removed and taken by tram to Plain Creek, where coffins were waiting to receive them. They were buried at Serina Cemetery at dusk on the 18th of November. A large crowd gathered for the ceremony. A bullet hole from the revolver was found just under the window in the back room, showing it had been fired from inside the house. Teddy and Dolly had walked home from the school 1.5 miles away with the children of the Carey family and another boy named Jimmy Aslett, leaving school at 3:40 p.m. and arriving home about 4:30 p.m. They evidently reached home as their bags were found in the house, but there was no sign of them, and fears were held for their safety too. A large search party was gathered of locals, the area around the farm scoured. Tall grass and lantana was combed and a well holding 14 feet of water carefully checked. On Sunday morning, the 19th of November, the bodies of the children were discovered laying in grass in a hollow in the so-called wood paddock, about 3/4 of a mile from their home. They had either been enticed away by the murderer or chased there. There were no marks on the bodies having been dragged there. Both children lay on their backs, Dolly in a light-coloured dress and white canvas shoes. Eddie was 2 yards from his sister, wearing a dark coat and striped galatea trousers, barefooted with his legs drawn up at the knees. Both bodies were decomposing rapidly in the heat, but it was evident that Eddie had been bashed severely about the head. Dolly had been shot in the left side of her head, just below her ear. The size of the bullet wound was comparable to that suffered by Maud, suggesting the same weapon was used in both killings. The children's hats lay nearby, suggesting they had been killed on the spot rather than their bodies carried there. A crowd had gathered on hearing the news, but were kept well back from the scene to avoid damaging evidence, while a native tracker named Dayton examined the area for clues. Prints left by boots were found in the ground nearby and cast with plaster of Paris. The bodies of the children were also taken by tram to Plain Creek and reunited with the other 4 victims of the massacre, being buried at 5 p.m. the same day they were found. A muzzle-loading gun found broken into pieces in the grass between the house and the kitchen was thought to have been used to shoot Agnes and then to bludgeon the 2 young children to death. In reconstructing the crime, police found a neighbour had heard 2 shots shortly after 3 p.m. It was deduced that as nothing in the house had been taken, that robbery was not the motive. It was thought instead the killer had gone into the bedroom and attempted to ravish Maud. It was conjectured that her mother had come to her aid, and Agnes was shot first, with the pellet also hitting Maud on the hand. As the teenage girl turned and screamed, she too was shot with the revolver. There had been one in the house which was now missing, although later it was thought that Maud had been shot while in a reclining position, so she may have been the first to be killed. The children may have witnessed the murders or not, but the killer decided to slaughter them too. Teddy and Dolly returned home from school soon after, and were likely lured away before they could see what had happened and murdered out in the paddock as well. George Silver, who had dallied in reporting the matter to police at Mackay on Saturday morning, had returned with the police to the farm and given a statement, after which he was detained, although not arrested. Silver himself asked to be locked in a police cell overnight at Serina, afraid he might be lynched. One night a group had gathered and yelled for the police to let Silver go, but nothing had come of it. When Silver saw the bodies of Eddie and Dolly, he had become visibly upset. A rumour that Silver had confessed was denied by police on the 21st of November. Police continued searching the farm and investigating the crime over the next few days. Remains of a fire where clothing had been burned was found in the vicinity of the farm. Among the ashes was found remains of a cheque made out to Charles for 2 guineas. Then on the 23rd of November, police announced they had arrested George Silver for the murders. Slowly but surely the web of evidence closed around Silver. He had been the only person still alive on the farm on the day of the killings. Silver's boots were removed and compared to the prints found near the children's bodies in the paddock. They matched exactly and were kept as evidence. When asked about the burnt clothing, he confessed he had burned one of his suits because he said he feared he might be suspected of the crime. As the clothing which had not burned was found to be blood-stained, it was a reasonable assumption. Also found with the clothing was a gold watch, which Silver foolishly said was his, that he had purchased it in Brisbane. When shown the watch, Charles Ching identified it as belonging to his wife, and proved it by providing a plush box with a number on the lid, which corresponded to a number on the watch. The box had been found outside in a drain after the murders. Silver dropped his pretense of innocence and indifference to the investigation and confessed. Silver showed police where the revolver used in the murders was hidden among trash near some young cane. He had shot Maud and Huey in the back bedroom, he admitted. The others, he said, had been slain by his accomplices, an Afghan farmer named Dooley Khan and his partner on the farm, a man named Sam Butler. Dooley had shot Mrs. Ching in the dining room and then killed the baby next. The three of them had conspired on the Sunday prior to the murders to conduct a raid on the farm. Police checked the veracity of the claim and found nothing to support the assertion that these other two men were in any way involved in the crime. Silver had become enamoured of Maud and had hopes of marrying her. Agnes, however, was against the idea, whether simply because of her daughter's age or because she did not think Silver was a suitable match is unknown. Facing the court on the 24th of November, Silver, who stood only 5'4", seemed to crouch even lower as if attempting to hide his face from gaze, until told to stand up when the charges were read. He was a sorry-looking and very dejected little figure, who seemed scarcely to have been physically able to have inflicted such horror. Public interest was intense. People had begun gathering under the banyan trees in front of the building long before 10 a.m, and clusters were all talking of the murder. One by one the names of the dead were read out and Silver accused of killing them. To each he denied he had killed them and had no questions to ask the police. He was remanded for 8 days in custody. The health officer gave evidence that the clothes found burnt about a mile from the house were stained in human blood. Silver was brought back into the court on the 27th of December, appearing more lively than at his initial appearance, and was asked about his movements leading up to the tragedy. He had been sick on the Tuesday prior to the murder. On Wednesday he had gone into Mackay and stayed until Thursday night. Asked what he was wearing, he said his work clothes, khaki pants, dungaree shirt, and the same hat and boots he was wearing then in court. He was asked when he changed his clothes. Silver said he slept in them and changed them Friday morning, the day of the murders, at 10 a.m. He explained he had done so because he wanted to go and see his girl Rosie. Silver then told the court he had shot a hawk that morning with Ching's gun. He went along the tram line down to Jimmy R. Singh's siding to see if he could see Rosie, but he had not seen her. Instead he claimed he fell asleep at the siding. He was woken by the Plain Creek engine going to Louisa Creek, but fell back asleep and was woken again when the same engine made its return journey. After that he went home following the tram line, except for a diversion to Anthony's house. He said he saw nobody there and went back to following the line. He reached home about 6, at the same time as Charles Ching. He said he thought Agnes might be out cutting grass, as she sometimes did. He and Charles got tea ready. While they had tea, Dooley Khan and Sam Butler had dropped in and stopped talking for about half an hour. All the time, Charles kept getting up and going outside to check if any of his family were about. Silver said he had taken a parcel containing his work clothes with him when he went to inform the neighbours and police about the crime. At first he said he took them with him to Mackay, but then said they were uncomfortable on the saddle, so he had tossed them by the side of the road. When he went to the spot he said he had thrown them with police a day later, The parcel could not be found. Constable Marr then took Silver to the railway siding to have him show him where he had slept. Once there, Silver said he had made a mistake, and this wasn't the place. They returned to the roadside to resume searching for the clothing, but after another hour and a half had found nothing. Dooley Khan testified that he and Sam had been drunk at the hotel with Silver on the day he said, but nothing was discussed about robbing the Chings. Khan and Butler usually saw the family every day and got on well with them. The preliminary hearings heard essentially the same evidence for each charge before Silver was committed for trial. He would stand trial only for the murder of Maud Ching. The trial began on the 20th of March 1912. Much of the same evidence from the preliminary hearings was reiterated. A hawker named Ballad Allah testified that he had encountered Silver at 9:45 a.m. on the 18th of November. Silver wanted to buy a pair of trousers and remarked that there was great trouble. Asked what, he said the Ching family, 4 of them murdered and 2 missing. He then said a white man had come and done it, probably a bushranger. He then said that he had been with Ching when the murders were committed. Silver had bought a shirt and trousers. Later, he met Sam Apu, a Ceylonese man, at a boarding house in Mackay, and offered him his old clothes, which Sam declined. He again told this man that a bushranger had killed the family. The next day, 21st of March, the trial ran all day. At first, Silver was in good spirits, but during the summing up by Judge Lucan in the evening, he became more anxious. As expected, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Maud Ching, which Silver took stoically. The judge, however, it was noticed, appeared uncomfortable as he passed the death sentence to end the day at 10 p.m. The High Court in May 1912 heard that statements made to the police by Silver were wrongly entered into evidence. Although Justice Rial stated he believed some of the questioning by police had been overbearing, no evidence of actual threat or violence had been made, and the sentence was affirmed. It is not known whether Charles knew of Silver's criminal past, but he had served 5 short prison sentences before working for the Chings. In May 1901, he was sentenced to 1 month for larceny at Muswell Brook, New South Wales, and in January 1903 he received another month for false pretences. In February 1904 he was sent inside for a year for actual bodily harm at Lismore. He cannot have been out for long before he was sent back to prison in February 1905 for 2 years for stealing. The 5th time he was imprisoned was in Mackay in January 1911 for 3 months, not long before he was employed by Charles. At 8 a.m. on the 10th of June 1912 at Boggo Road Jail, George David Silver was led to the gallows, his legs strapped together and the rope adjusted. He was then asked if he had anything to say. He thanked the prison officials for their kindness and then claimed that everyone involved had lied about everything and that he was completely innocent. He then asked God to bless his family, his friends, his enemies, and everyone in the world, and exhorted all who had not yet found God to do so. He had been a Christian for 4 years and had lived a pretty good life. He had led Salvation Army meetings in Mackay prior to the tragedy. He then repeated the 23rd Psalm and repeated that though he was passing through the shadow of death, he was not afraid. He then repeated the Lord's Prayer several times before saying he would not explain his case as it would take all day. He then said the Lord's Prayer again and urged people to seek God for 27 minutes. He repeated incessantly that he was going to heaven. Even as the white hood was pulled over his head, he continued to pray until the bolt was withdrawn and he dropped on the end of the hempen rope. He weighed 9 stone 2 pound. The regulation drop was loud and death was instantaneous. The body hung for 15 minutes before being lowered into the coffin. Silver was the 3rd last man executed in Queensland. The final 2 executions were carried out in 1913, and the death penalty abolished in the state in 1922. Among the reporters present to witness the execution was Harry Ching. Silver's body was buried at South Brisbane Cemetery. In 1915, Charles Ching, whose life had been devastated by the loss, turned 60 and decided he wanted to die in his homeland, so made preparations to return to Hong Kong. When he left, he was accompanied by Harry and May. Harry was well respected in Mackay, an athletic young man noted as a footballer, cricketer and swimmer, and a large number of friends came down to the wharf to farewell the family. In Hong Kong, Charles married again and fathered another son, named John Shum. May married an American named Harvey Decker in Guangdong in November 1921, but sadly passed away in Hong Kong in 1927, aged just 33. Harry Ching had landed a job with the South China Morning Post in 1916, and in 1924 was appointed editor. He remained in that role until 1957, except for the war years when Japan occupied Hong Kong, and the Post was renamed the Hong Kong News. Although some of the Asian staff remained to run the paper, the European staff were interred as prisoners, and Harry refused to collaborate, instead surviving by selling possessions and accepting charity from friends to keep himself and his wife, whom he married in 1926, alive. Harry was awarded the Officer of the British Empire in 1950. He passed away on the 31st of March, 1968. Of the two elder daughters who avoided the family massacre, Florence Wong died in 1966 and Henrietta Steindl in February 1974. Both ladies had many descendants who still remember and honour their relatives taken from them on a day of madness long ago. By a terrible twist of fate, one of the men whom Silver attempted to implicate in the crime, Dooley Khan, also became a victim of violence. Dooley was born in Jalandhar in the Punjab and had been in Australia about 40 years and had been a cane farmer but retired in 1936 when his eyesight failed, and in 1939 was aged 70 and lived on a pension. He had lived in the Habana district for at least 12 years. At 9 a.m. on the 16th of May 1939, at Reliance Creek, Habana, 12 miles north of Mackay, a 34-year-old man named Spiro Zammit, a labourer who lived nearby, went to the hut where Dooley lived with another man named John Nardo, and asked where Dooley was. Nardo, who had been outside mending a horse collar, told the man that he was inside the hut, whereupon Zammit entered, and soon after a gunshot reverberated through the small building. Dooley had been shot through the head with a revolver. Zammit exited and told Nardo he had shot Dooley because the old man was using black magic on him, and asked him to inform the police. Once notified, they arrived at 10:30 a.m. and found Zammit lying on the veranda of the Habana store, looking ill. When asked what had happened, he replied, "I shot Dooley Khan. He was using some magic on me in some way, and I had to shoot him. He used black magic that gave me a terrible pain in the head, and it was killing me." He claimed he had not been able to eat or sleep for 4 days and had a severe headache. Zammit was taken back to the hut. On the way, he was asked what he had done with the revolver. He said he had waited for a while, and when nobody came, he threw it in some water. He was arrested and taken to the station, but collapsed in a cell and was transferred to hospital under guard. During remand proceedings, a certificate tendered to the court stated that Zammit was suffering from delusions and required medical and hospital care. When proceedings recommenced, it was announced that Zammit was insane, and the charge of willful murder was withdrawn, and he was ordered to be detained at Goodna Asylum. Dooley Khan, who had no known relatives in Australia, was buried at Mackay City Cemetery.